Nau mai, hoki mai, kia the fold, e mihine, ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. My guest today is Paula Browning, who is the chair of an organisation which, even the sort of hyper-informed listeners of this podcast might not necessarily have heard of. It's called WeCreate, and it's, I think, done something quite clever, which is to sort of reconceive of itself as a sort of an advocacy for the fundamental value and particularly the economic value of a giant raft of different sort of sectors and subsectors and what have you that ultimately create a sort of, or ladder up to sitting under the umbrella of the cultural and creative sectors. So they include things like design, advertising, media, film, television, gaming, fashion. But if you think of it and it sort of fits there, it's probably in there. And cumulatively, various sort of studies put the value of the sector at around $15 billion. So, these numbers are always kind of hard to kind of put a precise value on. I'm sure if you did some kind of meta study that was of all of the different industries in New Zealand and the value of them to New Zealand, they would come out a lot larger than GDP. But setting that aside, the thing that's under, the galvanizing force underneath WeCreate is, I think, a very important one, which is to sort of get government in particular to sort of recognize the value of creative and cultural sector work, and particularly to create a joined up, coherent strategy that helps realize it and views it as an opportunity for growth and for exports and for all the things that we want our economy to do in the same way that we currently do with agriculture or with tourism. And to do that, they've got a briefing for and a request from whoever the next government might be, and that's to have a minister to represent the cultural and creative sector. And it's a minister, not a ministry. They're not asking for a huge new bureaucracy there, which would inevitably overlap with some parts of MCH and MB, but just someone who can basically listen to and advocate for the potential of the sector and try and get a sort of joined up strategy that works across different aspects of government. And it's a really interesting idea. We've got National talking about a minister for space. Why not something a bit more earthbound as well? So that's essentially what the meat of this conversation is about. We look at what the government is currently doing across a whole bunch of sectors, and honestly, it's kind of a mess. There's parts of government that are, in this space that are about funding specific projects and not others. And there's others that are about giving big tax rebates that are really available to anyone, provided they meet the criteria. There are whole other parts of the sector that just have absolutely nothing. And there are still others where not only do they have nothing, they don't even really have an economic opportunity to exploit, because there is, like earlier today, I met with these TikTokers who have a huge audience and genuinely are starving, like literally are not eating at all, because there is no way to monetize these huge audiences that they built up for this, powerful Chinese-owned technology app. And none of this is an easy solve, but at least if you have a single person who kind of understands the way the whole thing operates and where there are inequities and opportunities and outdated legislation that's never enforced, if you had someone trying to patch up all that or have a blank slate and redraw it, I think some pretty great things could happen. And that's certainly what Paula and WeCreate think. And so I think this feels like quite well timed. I'm recording this ahead of the election. It's coming out just after it. But in terms of, the media, which is unavoidably contained by WeCreate, if we sort of, think about the good that could be done if there were legislation drawn that was about the environment as it stands now rather than as it stood in 1989 or 1995 or whenever the relevant legislation was last put together, then maybe some good things might come of that. So that's what this discussion about. This is Paula Browning, the chair of WeCreate, here on The Fold. Tenakwe, Paula, welcome to The Fold.
Kia ora, Duncan. Lovely to be here.
I was wondering if you could start by telling me about the genesis of WeCreate and sort of what sort of forged it.
Yes, certainly. So WeCreate started out as the Copyright Council of New Zealand way back in the 90s when the Copyright Act first came into being in Aotearoa. And my first connection with it was when I started at Copyright Licensing New Zealand, which is the licensing agency for publishing and more recently for visual artists. And by default, I became the treasurer of the Copyright Council, guilty of being an accountant in a previous life and love a number, but no good at being an accountant. So we had some meetings of the Copyright Council, and I'm like, as somebody who wasn't from the creative sector, I didn't quite get it, why we were talking about law when the organisations that were represented in the Copyright Council were making these amazing things like screen productions and books and music, and why were we only talking about the one piece of it? So a friend of mine from the recorded music industry and I got together and went, let's see if we can convince people to do this differently, and WeCreate was born. And since then we've grown the membership to represent all of the creative industries, and also to make some really good connections in government, with the tech sector, into arts and culture, and in education as well. So our members are the membership associations within each of the creative industries. So it's quite an interesting membership model. So for, say, in music, Recorded Music New Zealand, APRA, Independent Music New Zealand, the Music Managers Forum, they're all members of ours. And all of the individual creative industries have members that form part of our group.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes it so interesting and potentially tricky, kind of trying to align the interests of like dozens of quite disparate organisations. And I want to get into that. But before then, let's sort of drill in a bit to the copyright piece of it. What is the state of our copyright legislation, and how sort of, there's all kinds of challenges to copyright, generative AI being the very kind of current one. But what is the current state of copyright in New Zealand?
So the government started to look at revising or reviewing the Act in 2017, and there was some work done by MB, which is the responsible agency. And then things happened, reduced priority. Actually, pre-COVID, the review was stopped. I don't think it's officially off the table, but certainly nothing's been happening with it since then. I think we saw the sort of responses that you would expect as you see around the world when copyright is reviewed. There are certainly sides to the argument, and we also saw something that I hope if we get back to reviewing the Act we won't see again, and that the government really wasn't properly resourced in order to undertake such a comprehensive review. They pretty much wanted to look at the entire piece of legislation, where if you look at where success has happened in terms of reviewing copyright legislation, like in Australia recently, they've broken it up into pieces and gone, okay, we're going to look at that bit and then we'll look at that bit, and it just makes it a more achievable piece of legislative review. But the thing I'd really like us to see, an approach I'd like us to take when we do get back to reviewing it, is to understand the importance of it, and also that having legislation without enforcement is really not much use to anybody, and also some power imbalances. Your individual New Zealand author versus Google is not really a fair game, and I think Kiwis like to see Kiwis get a fair chance. So I'd like to see that come through the review as well.
Can we just sort of there's a bit of a very top line thing that you mentioned there, but can we talk about some specifics of how that's expressed? So for example, like one of the sort of signature realities of the internet, particularly the sort of social and user-generated content internet, is that it feels like copyright has been obliterated, that a lot of what is created and shared through, social platforms in particular, which generates an ever larger share of audience, is either just wholesale repurposed, i.e. with very little added or subtracted from it, or just a sort of taken out of context and put there kind of thing. TikTok is full of pieces of material that are nominally under copyright to someone else that are just there, and they're almost impossible to surface if they were trying to find them. Do you just throw up your hands at that, or is there a way that you don't blunt the kind of opportunity of those platforms, but you do see fairer compensation for people who created those original works that are being repurposed? Yeah,
and I think there's the challenge in that is, when does money start to be made, and then who gets to make the money?
Yeah.
So, the money gets spent in developing the technology. So obviously there's an investment there by the social media platform, but then it's just a platform without content, right? So whose content? Where does it come from? Is it, in some cases you have willing participants who know what they're up for, and the content that they're putting there, that's fine. That's the game they want to play. I think when there's money being made and that money is not being fairly shared, then you start to see people going, well, why should I play there? And actually, I don't get to negotiate how I play there, because, there's terms and conditions that are the same for everybody. And if I want to be there and that's where my audience is, or that's, where my messaging sits best, then I don't really have a choice. And that's why I think we've got more diversity now in that space than we've had before, but we certainly don't have the business models that are fair to the creator if the creator chooses that they want to be paid for what it is that's in there. And the bit that always gets me with these companies is it's technology, right? So they know exactly what's being watched, who made it, and if you wanted to, with somebody with collective management experience like I've got, if you wanted to share the money out, you've got all the data you need to do it. So it's not like they can't say, we don't know. They could say, it's just about where the money ends up getting. And I think, you're starting to have, it's not social media, but, platforms like Spotify, you are actually starting to see conversations about, what is actually fair? And making sure the creator has a stronger voice in that.
Yes, so Spotify is becoming creator economy, even if it's not, and user-generated content, even if it's not social in the same way some other platforms are. But, there is an example in YouTube's revenue share model, which does seem to kind of actively incentivize the right things, and there are people able to make a living on it in the way that they can't really off of the likes of, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok in the same way. Do you think that kind of some sort of regulator that forces more data sharing and kind of brokers more equitable agreements in that regard? Because the music industry, for example, with TikTok has managed to kind of interact with it in a way where that's becoming a significant revenue pipeline, but there isn't a film, television, other creators don't share in revenues generated by the platform to the same extent.
Yeah, I think that the development of new licensing models, so we've got primary sales models, or we've got free.
Yeah.
And in between all of that is licensing. And what does licensing look like? And I don't think those models have evolved in the same way because of that power imbalance. You haven't been able to bring people to the table. And I know you're passionate about the media bargaining code and, the mechanisms that are needed to bring, organisations, particularly ones who aren't based here, who you can't get into a room and have a commercial conversation with. What are the levers that are needed to bring them to the table, or just to have a fair negotiation around licensing. And I think licensing is, coming from the publishing industry, you've seen it in the ebook market as well, where libraries now license most of their content. They're not buying it, they're accessing it digitally, and they're paying a license fee rather than a primary sale fee. And it's actually a nice, midway is not the right number, what the right way to describe it, but it's a nice in-between mechanism that means people are getting paid, but you're not having to pay necessarily the same rate as you would if it was a primary sale. And it solves the access issue, right, in a way that's fair for the creator. So the world gets access, but the creator gets paid if they choose to be paid. And licensing to me is pretty much the answer to everything.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we'll touch on that again. But let's kind of go back to that sort of foundation piece with WeCreate. Some of the numbers that you talk about now, you basically, the reason I've got you up here, there's a briefing that you've kind of created for whoever the incoming, government is, and a suggestion of a new minister. But I guess before you get to do that, you've got this huge, your scale comes from having a lot of different sectors and organisations represented. But how do you align that, this very large group, which often can be arguing within it's amongst itself or even within an organisation, to the point where you can have everyone, agreeing on something to be put down like this as in front of an incoming government?
So we only operate at a sector level. We don't get into either individual creative industries discussions or between the industries. And we're the only organisation that plays there, so it's a space we can occupy. And for us, which is why we've put out this ask for a Minister for the Creative and Cultural Economy, it's about demonstrating value and the importance of the sector. And at a sector level, and you'll see this probably even within your teams, it's more of an ecosystem than it is an individual sector, say like dairy, where people move around in it. And, it can be a media one day, book publishing the next, next minute you're blogging for something, and it's not linear. So the parts of it move a lot. And we've managed to make a place for ourselves where we have focused with very limited resource on being the voice to government for the value of the whole ecosystem rather than the individual parts of it. And that has resonated with government to an extent, particularly at an officials level. It's government officials level. We've had some good traction there. But the challenge that you've got when you don't have a minister and parts of your ecosystem aren't actually even represented in government is trying to get some focus and some intentionalism around what it is that we can bring. Both the sector can bring to the country and to the economy in particular.
Well, when you do speak to beyond the officials to actually politicians themselves, is the idea of a minister for the creative and culture sectors, is it a new one, and how has it been received when it's brought to them? Yeah,
it would be a new portfolio, and the intention would be for it to have a high cabinet ranking, and that's to get the priority on it.
Yeah.
So that it is absolutely seen as contributing to the country, not something that is about, and I don't like the F word, the funding word, I like I for investment. It's not something that just needs a lot of investment, that we can actually see the moving parts of it that actually are about export, that are about, jobs and value, that looks a little bit different maybe than how government's used to thinking about the sector. And that's where we think that having a minister with all of it bundled up into the one role would make a difference. We're not asking for a ministry, we're not asking for a whole new part of government to do this. With a minister, what we'd want is a mandate from Cabinet for them to be able to reach into the various government agencies that have work in the sector, whether that's Foreign Affairs and Trade, or whether it's the various parts of MBIA, or whether it's Manaatu Tonga. There are multiple agencies that, as a sector, that we interact with, and this minister role would provide some focus and a work program across all of them.
In terms of the makeup of your member organisations, and particularly the scale of the financial elements of them, the biggest one by far, which represents more than half of the revenues, which I think is it around 15 billion that you 10 billion of that is design alone, which sort of surprised me in a way, but I guess it's about how you sort of define that. Do you want to talk about what's inside design in particular, because that is such a big number, and then about what the other kind of main constituent parts are?
So you've asked about my favourite thing, numbers. The numbers are just to tell a story, right? It's not all about the numbers. So the numbers that we published are the various industries' numbers. The $15 billion number is a number that Manata Tonga, the Ministry of Culture and Heritage, have pulled together using Infometrics. And then there's the individual industry numbers that they do for themselves. Those reports are not compiled using the same methodology. So the design report actually talks about the value of design to the country, with where design is the design sector itself plus design that happens elsewhere in the economy. So that is an overall value of design to New Zealand, not just the design industry piece. We did a similar piece of work when we went back in 2016 and tried to get government hadn't valued the sector for years. And we got the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research to do a number, and at that stage it came in at $17.5 billion, but equally that was about the value of creativity to the country. And
this can get quite woolly quite quickly.
It can get very woolly. The interesting thing, I think, from, in terms of our discussion of the value of creativity to the country, is a third of creative professionals work outside the creative industries. So design team at Fisher & Paykel. It's where creativity is happening in the economy outside of the creative industries. It's also important, but the bit that obviously interests us the most is the core value of the sector. And design is obviously a big component of that.
What are some of the other chunky pieces?
Well, screen is the logical next one. And again, it just comes down to what you include and what don't you include. Big discussion in the industry at the moment. If everything you consume on a screen, is that screen? Or is screen traditionally like film as it was? Does it include TV, put games in there? And this is the challenge of being an ecosystem, right? It's got lots of moving parts. And I mean, really what we want to be able to say is it has value. And quite often, particularly if we're talking arts and culture, we don't necessarily think about the value in numeric terms as well as in the social and cultural sense. And that's certainly where we've been trying to elevate the conversation particularly with government about, this stuff matters and we need to pay more attention to it.
If you look at the sort of scale of the sectors that you represent, one thing which sort of and then the way that government interacts with those various sectors, there's a shitload going on. It's kind of a mess. Wrong. There's not like a real logic that you can say, well, if we do something this way over here, in gaming, say, that we'll do it in a similar way within television and in film and in design or fashion or books. It's kind of all over the shop. And I hope I'm not being rude to government here, that it doesn't feel like that there is a really strong logical reason why it's different for each sector. It's just that they were done at different times and according to a particularly persuasive argument at the time that the thing happened. And then largely, as with most things government, you just keep doing it. What is your sort of broad sense of how those various, funding, investment, rebate, co-working space, all of that big sort of mess of interaction, is it working? How could it be made more logical, or is this the way it has to be?
I think that expression fit for purpose is a question that the government needs to ask itself in relation to being a good partner for the sector. And in terms of its form, at the moment, it probably isn't. And a lot of those, and this is nothing against the amazing people that work in those organisations, because they work with what they've got from a structural perspective. But we look at how the sector works now, and I mean, it's one of the sectors that is changing the most rapidly. And you need the government to be able to partner in a way that can keep up, basically. And within some organisations, there are attempts to keep up, but some of those organisations are hampered by legislation. Getting legislative change takes time. And when it comes to, keeping pace with technology, licensing systems, you've got to be able to move fast. Hopefully not break things, but move fast. And the government part doesn't at this stage. So, we'd be hoping that there's an appetite for government to reorganise itself in a way that is more fit for purpose in terms of how it works with the sector, so that we can maximise the opportunity and things don't get, siloed or locked down in one particular place.
So this the ask for a minister goes along with a sort of a package that explains why. Mm-hmm. Do you want to sort of detail what's in that and essentially make the argument? And
the why is more about opportunity than it is about a problem. I mean, we've just talked about one thing that really is a problem, but the opportunity for economic diversification and also for New Zealand to actually do more of something it's really good at. As we sort of, we're talking about big issues like climate change. We're talking about economic diversification, market diversification. We've got a bit of an issue with our trade in that sense. And the ability for a small country down the bottom of the world to actually reach audiences and paying customers in all sorts of places that, of course, 30 years ago, before the internet was invented, we couldn't do in the same way. And we haven't really had anything intentional around how the creative sector might contribute more to the economy. And that's really what we're asking for. And again, back to sort of WeCreate's genesis around being a voice for the economic outcomes that the sector is capable of. So, I mean, we reckon we can make it to 25 billion in 7 years by 2030. That's 10% year-on-year compound growth. That doesn't seem like too much. I mean, who knows what it could be. And that's going to take us up well beyond agriculture and some of the other industries at a time when that's what the country needs. And it's inherently in our DNA. It's also, I think, a really massive opportunity. And I don't like talking about it this way, but it's the language that government uses, and that's the Māori economy. The opportunity to take New Zealand's unique culture to new audiences and businesses internationally that also grows the opportunity for Māori. I think that's something we should absolutely be doing something about.
In terms of how that gets executed, the gaming sector, recently had must be considered a big win for the organisation in terms of the rebates, which go some way to matching the equivalent sort of system in Australia, and there is so you have that, and then you have the sort of screen production rebates. Then you also have this whole other piece that is much more about what comes under the umbrella of sort of picking winners kind of thing, where whether it's New Zealand On Air or Te Mangai Paho or the Film Commission, and there are other equivalents too, where the government sort of hears bids and then you prefer the term investment to funding, but often they still use the term funding, but they basically wholly fund some things and don't fund others at all. Is there especially as we move into this sort of more fluid area, and certainly when you look internationally at how this kind of thing is typically handled, it feels like the picking winners thing is a little, could be seen as a bit anachronistic versus the sort of more mechanistic. We want to incentivize the growth of this area, and we'll create a sort of tax or incentive wrap around that. Does WeCreate have a perspective on which of those approaches it thinks is more sort of efficient or more likely to achieve that sort of regular step change growth?
No, we don't. We're not a participant in that system ourselves. And I think the thing for us is the responsiveness of it, and being able to get a footing in being able to compete internationally in areas where maybe we haven't been able to, or where, like with the games rebate, we had a great start in terms of what the industry had done for itself, but in order to get that next level of scale, some action was required, and that was what was needed in order for that particular industry. I think it's back to the point again about the responsiveness and being able to move quickly, and having mechanisms in there, and that's always difficult when it comes to government, right? Because the taxpayer is always looking at where the investment goes and what the value of that investment and the return was. But these are all the sort of the roles and the industries that we're talking about. They're the jobs that we want. They're the highly productive, highly scalable type of industries where they can do so much more when there's the right sort of wraparound mechanisms with them. What that looks like and how that would work in the individual industries. I don't think we've had a conversation about that. We keep doing similar things, but we don't sort of question whether or not it's as effective as it might be in some areas. And coming from the publishing world, as I did, there's nothing for publishing. Publishing doesn't have a home in government. Do we know what international publishing looks like? No. Does the government understand it? No. And yet there's there's amazing things that could be done. And particularly, I think, we're looking very outwardly, especially around the export side of things. And we don't have trade. We don't have a trade mechanism for understanding digital trade, or understanding what exporting digital from down the bottom of the world actually looks like, and how we can grow that, and what the support systems around that need to be either. So I think, there's a conversation to be had, and that's, again, the reason for asking for a minister is I think the industry ecosystem's ready to have that conversation. The government probably needs to be coming a little bit further, and you would hope to see some leadership with that minister in starting that conversation.
So the sort of flip side of all this, I don't know if you read, there's a recent Matthew Hooden column in the New Zealand Herald, which talked about what he described as a peculiarity in New Zealand's sort of political business access, where, as he described it, a lot of New Zealand businesses spend an inordinate amount of time interacting with and thinking about and talking to or lobbying politicians for regulatory change in a way which would be sort of unimaginable in a lot of other economies. And this goes to that sort of fairly well-known New Zealand initiative or Taxpayers Union critique of things like the screen production rebates, which is essentially that, that the because there is no tax left over, or because it's basically recycling the tax revenues which are generated by it, that it, the opportunity cost to New Zealand of having a lot of our best and brightest in that sector is, such that, if every sector was to behave the same way, we'd all have great jobs and we'd have no tax revenue. That's the sort of critique of it. What is the answer of WeCreate to that idea that, that if there is a privileging of creative sectors and that they are given special tax treatment, or that ultimately they aren't contributing enough to the overall tax take of the economy?
I can't say that is a specific question that we've ever asked ourselves, and it's not really where we get too involved in. I think some of that comes back to a value discussion, where there's a perception that the value that is generated isn't sufficient to justify the investment in it. And I think we do have an issue, a perception issue or a reality issue around how we value creativity and the creative sector. And without somebody who came from the sports industry in the past as well, we don't question what we invest in terms of sport. Funnily enough, both the funding streams come through the Ministry of Culture and Heritage. Money for sport goes out the door and nobody seems to ask any questions. And then everything that happens around the creative sector, or maybe I'm just oversensitive, seems to be like, well, why are you doing that? You know, it gets questioned to a level that I don't know that other things get questioned. But, you know, we can't, as a country, be a one-show pony, right? And we know we can't keep relying on the stuff that we've relied on. And we just think that inherently we're good at this stuff and that we can compete. And that with some of the issues that we've got facing us as a country now, we could pay more attention to this. And I'm not suggesting that is, all of the mechanisms that we currently have are right, or that we've got the complete answer to that either, because we don't. But at a sector level, we think that we can do better at it. And the bit that's missing here is not the connectedness of the sector, but it's the government piece. If we look to the UK and Australia, Australia has a new national cultural policy called Revive. It's a whole of government approach to the sector. And in the UK, it was started by a minister over there who went, right, we're going to get every government agency to consider the creative industries before they set policy. And, we're going to have this massive target of growing creative exports. I can't remember what the number was, but it was incrementally massive. And they've done it. And it's helped them, again, economic diversification. I just don't think we look at creativity through an economic lens sufficiently, and then understand the value of that in a way that helps us to have a more balanced conversation about it, not just being something we throw money at.
Right. I mean, I guess that the sort of what I'm getting, because I see the economic argument. I guess there is just a sort of where I think the critique feels like it holds water is that, well, imagine that you get what you wish for, but the price you pay for it is effectively making it almost like a tax-exempt part of the economy, and then you actually get a different kind of problem out the other side. Does it, or to put it another way, is there a way of achieving some of what you want that doesn't require government to kind of recycle tax revenue? Like, if the amount of money that like, for example, what goes on in film in terms of the fact that a New Zealand On Air funded production can also now sit under the screen production rebate. Like, there are some quite extraordinary levels of support there that are obviously unsustainable if you start to scale them out across different sectors of the economy. For example, could a sort of step change to a licensing regime that we're able to interact with technology companies, like could wins like that are fiscally neutral, say, to the treasury kind of budgetary aspects of this, also produce major gains, or will it actually ultimately come down to sort of matching or moving on the kind of rebate tax into the spectrum? God, this is we're really in we're in a particular area.
Who said
here,
numbers were a good thing? I don't think there's a country in the world that invests in culture and expects it to be fiscally neutral. And particularly for a small country with a unique culture, we are going to have to invest to some level. What we found, and Screen is a brilliant example of this, is what we found is when we have made those investments and we have invested in culture, that often the things that you get around that with the skills development, with the industry growth, then you've got an ability to do so much more than that. And you would hope that there will be things that stand on their own financially outside of the cultural investment piece. And look, the arts and culture ecosystem is, very much where the talent grows and, where a lot of the skills and capability development happens. Can you, in a global market where, thanks to a lot of the technology companies, the starting point for stuff, for creative content, is often free, how do you make that work? And that's a difficult conversation. Back to the licensing thing where, it's about where's the money coming from. And if you can't make something for the price of what you're likely to generate from it, then you've got a gap. And if you want to have that cultural output, if you want to make that amazing creative stuff, then you've got a gap to fill. What is the best way of doing that? Pass. But I think, as I said, I think we need to be having a conversation, and you can't do it without government in this space, about what that looks like in 2023 and beyond, because at the moment we've got mechanisms that look backwards. They don't look forwards. And as I said before, they don't respond quickly enough to how things change.
So say you get your wish and there is this sort of shiny new minister for you. Let's imagine that they get a couple of terms and they're sort of looking back at, from pretty close to that sort of goal year of 2030. What would that sort of creative and cultural economy look like, and what are some, maybe pick 2 or 3 of the things that you think that changes they could make that might have the biggest impact in terms of stepping you towards that goal?
I think they'd be talking about the sector more in economic circles, not exclusively, and New Zealand would have stopped questioning the value of investing in arts, culture and creativity. We'd have reached our goal of $25 billion of earnings, and a lot of that would be coming from digital exports, so we'd be doing our bit to contribute to a more climate-friendly economy. My personal hope, don't quote WeCreate on this one, is that New Zealanders would inherently value creativity in the same way as they do sport. And we wouldn't be questioning the investment or the support that goes into it. And we would be absolutely as excited about international success of our creativity in the same way as we do when our sports teams win, when they're offshore. That's
a pretty exciting and noble goal. Thank you so much for coming on the fold today, Paula, and talking us through that, and good luck with that quest to just get a cheeky minister out for your sectors.
It's been great to be here. Thanks a lot, Duncan.
That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.